Okay, I won't start again, but just for those Zoomers at home, we've got a minor technical problem here. The microphone isn't being projected into the room, so I've got to speak a bit louder so the attendees can hear me. Just a few reminders that this you've heard that this has been recorded. It goes out onto the World Wide Web, so if you want to remain anonymous, you'd better turn your cameras off, although it's preferable that they're on. But that's just a minor procedure. Welcome to our first meeting for December, the first day of summer. And I can't think of what else to say. I'm a bit thrown by the microphone not working. Once the speaker has finished speaking, we'll be taking questions from the Zoomers at home. And on the bottom right hand of your screen, there's I forget what it says now, but the very bottom one, it says raise hand. If you press on that, a little yellow hand comes up. Rob Brown in the control room can see that you wish to ask a question, and he will nominate you to ask a question of the speaker. So I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Michael Brand. Michael says he was here a couple of years ago, and he's back by popular request. Now the light's gone out. Goodness me. Oh, no, it's back on again. Dr. Michael Brand is the head and founder of Otzma Analytics, a data science consultancy dedicated to maximising clients' value from data by providing analytics, upskilling, project review, and executive monitoring. Before founding Otzma in 2018, Michael served as Chief Data Scientist at Telstra, as Senior Principal Data Scientist at Pivotal, as Chief Scientist at Verint Systems, and as CTO Group Algorithm Leader at PrimeSense, where he worked on developing the XBox Kinect. Dr. Brand also served as director of the Monash Centre for Data Science in his role as Associate Professor for Data Sciences and at Monash University, where he remains an adjunct. Dr. Brian holds a PhD in IT from Monash University, MSc, Bachelor of Science, I gather, in Applied Mathematics from the Weizmann Institute of Science, and a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from Tel-Aviv University. He has made industry-defining contributions that have earned him 18 patents, with more pending, garnered many prestigious industry and academic awards, and powered flagship products for the companies he has worked for. So welcome, Michael, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can share my screen. Okay, can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. So, so I'm Michael Brand, and thanks for joining this talk about Facebook and election influence. And you might be thinking that this is a very topical issue because Facebook has been in the news quite a lot recently. You may have heard of it in one of probably two contexts. One is a long stream of scandals it was involved in. There was the whistleblower who exposed tens of thousands of internal documents. There were Congress hearings about child endangerment. There were talks about how the company is buttoning down its internal communications following all of these things. On the right side, however, Facebook has changed its name, and it's now Meta. And in case you are wondering whether that means you'll need to find a new app, a new name, a new button to press in order to log in, no. What's actually going on is that there is a holding company, which used to be called Facebook and is now called Meta, that owns the Facebook app, Instagram, WhatsApp, the Messenger, and that has changed its name to Meta. And that's in fact quite common. I mean, Google does the same. It has a holding company called Alphabet. So yeah, it sounds very topical, but in fact, this talk is a talk that I've been giving for years now. And the only thing that keeps changing is that the numbers that I need to quote steadily become worse. So I have to continue updating them. By the way, these are the perhaps flagship products of Meta. It also has acquired about 100 other companies and does many, many other things besides. For example, it wants you to talk about the fact that it bought the Oculus VR company because now Meta wants to be all about virtual reality, and that should be the topic of conversation. It doesn't want you to speak about the fact that it bought Onavo, which is spyware of sorts that tells Facebook everything that you're doing when you're not on the Facebook app and not on any app owned by Meta. It allegedly has been the case that Facebook has gained some competitive advantage in knowing which of its competitors to buy out and when because of use of this. So we're talking about two different things, Facebook and Meta. And in this particular talk, the differences are not going to be very important. We're going to talk about election influence by Meta that is done through the Facebook app. So for our purposes, they're one and the same. A bit of context and background. Who am I and what do I do? So you've heard the long version of it. I've been a data scientist for over 30 years now, including some quite high profile positions globally. And some years back, I started a new consulting company for analytics called Otzma Analytics, and it does two things. One is it deals with strategic data science, which is the kind of data science that you use in order to get qualitative advantage and not just quantitative advantage. And what we're talking about here certainly qualifies. And the other thing that I do is meta research. So not research on Meta, but rather research on other people's research. So usually what I do is companies invite me to look at stuff that their own data scientists have been doing in order to stress test it, kick the tires, that kind of thing. Not in this talk. In this talk, we are going to talk about research that I've been collating for you from many researchers all around the world, each one showing just a tiny bit of this large beast, and hopefully we'll be able to draw for you an entire picture. What I never do, aside from dealing with things that are topical, is politics. So in case you thought that a talk about election influence is going to involve at some point political opinions, not here. I am going to simply tell you the facts as evenly as I can, hoping that you'll be able to keep to that line also in the Q&A. So the first thing that I'm often asked is, why am I picking on Facebook? Why not just say social media and election influence? And this has been a thing. I mean, this has been even a thing for Joe Biden, who recently had to walk back from a statement that Facebook kills. And there was no such walk back when his own Surgeon General issued recently a statement that social media kills. Very similar to the statement about smoking from years back, except there was no big impact on this. Nobody seemed to have even heard that this happened. So I could have gone the safe way, but I didn't want to, because I don't want to talk about social media. I want to talk specifically about Facebook and how it does things. And the reason why is because it's the biggest bully in the yard. If you look at our online time investment, they have about 1/8 of the total time, just the app, that we spend online. If you look at everything that the company does, it's even worse than that. And that number, 1/8, is completely out of proportion with anything else, with even the nearest competitor. They also have an unbelievable number of users. Their monthly active users are almost half of the total planet's human population. We're not talking about the Western world or anything like that. We're talking about every person on the planet. People who do not have running water have Facebook. And if you were to just count people over 7, I think they're already over half. And contrary to popular belief, people do use them to get their news. 43% of Americans read their news on Facebook, probably a figure that I should start updating because it has been going up. More than twice the nearest competitor. They also have these very, very deep pockets. So when the pandemic started, they were doing $70.7 billion a year in revenue. That's like the entire GDP of all of Bulgaria. And now they are at $112 billion in the last 4 quarters. So to put that into perspective, they started off as Bulgaria at the start of the pandemic, and since then they've added another Venezuela. Now they're on par with Costa Rica approximately, I would say. Now of that, about 58%, so over $65 billion, were spent on operating costs. And what that means is that they could pay for a whole lot of data scientists and social psychologists and behavioral economists and persuasion technologists and addiction specialists and all manner of other things. They actually have right now 68,000 employees and are planning to hire 10,000 more for their new VR things. And they still have enough left to pay the salaries of a few billionaires. So unbelievably deep pockets, and they've been using them. The other thing that has always bothered me about Facebook is that their terms of service are bad. They're very draconian. And what you see here is an analysis not by myself, but by legal scholars who summarize their terms of service, which are a 200-page document that none of you has read, as Facebook can use any of your stuff for any reason they want without paying you for advertising in particular. And if we were to look at a different analysis by other legal scholars, you will see that Facebook has been ranked as a Class E. This is in a Class A through Class E system. So they are the worst. Their terms of service raise very serious concerns, is what Class E means. And as you can see, there's a lot of no-goes, a lot of no-nos, not a single thumbs up in this entire thing.
Oh, God.
And you may be thinking, but that's par for the course. I mean, it is what the internet is. This is what we do these days. And the answer is no. This is what happens if you look at other comparable companies. Now, I don't think anybody would have been surprised by the fact that DuckDuckGo gets a Class A or that Wikipedia gets a Class B. But Google and Amazon both get Class C, and Facebook's most direct competitors, being Twitter and YouTube, both are Class D. So Facebook really is a standout in all of this. And they have a really, really bad history with ethics. I mean, you may think that the fact that they have this row of scandals now is unusual, but it isn't. It's been that way throughout. And when people ask me, well, since when has it been like this, that every 5 minutes they have a scandal? The answer is from the first 5 minutes. This is an IM exchange between Mark Zuckerberg and a college friend very, very shortly, months after starting Facebook. And I won't read it out to you. And I have censored it because I don't like profanities. But you get the picture. This is a company that from the get-go never at any point had ethics or people's best interests in its DNA. And they are an immersive environment that is geared to sell. And to make my point here, let me quote to you Jeff Hammerbacher, who was a co-founder of Facebook, who back in 2011 said this: "The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads." And he added, "That sucks." I think that when he said this, what he meant was that these best minds of his generation could be at the same time working on curing cancer. And it's really bad that they are clicking ads or thinking about how to make people click ads instead. And yeah, that's bad. But in hindsight, I think what is even worse is that when you have the best minds of a generation thinking about how to convince people to click ads, what will happen is that they will develop a super weapon for convincing. And that's exactly what happened. And Facebook is a realization of that super weapon. From a perspective of a data scientist, you just cannot get better than Facebook. It's an ideal laboratory in which you can exert maximum influence on people. You have complete control of stimuli. You can collect pretty much all online reactions. You have a very captive audience that stays with you for long stretches. It's a very addictive environment. And most of that environment, 74% of adult Facebook users in the US, for example, are just unaware that the site collects traits and preferences and uses these to sell to advertisers and changes what it looks like to you based on this. So most audience is an unsuspecting audience. You cannot get better than this if what you want is to convince people and to build a laboratory for convincing people. Let's move on to some common misconceptions, because usually when I start talking about how Facebook influences, people think, yeah, but that's not me. Why? Because, well, for example, you might say, well, only stupid people can be influenced like that. Well, if that's what you think, you'd be wrong. And here's a primer, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, that I can recommend to gain more insights on that. Basically speaking, these techniques are built on universal cognitive biases. All of us have them. It's just our way that our brains are wired. Human beings are like that, and we've learned how to hack the human brain. The second thing people tell me is, if I know they're doing it to me, I can ignore it. Well, no. And for that, I recommend Netflix's The Social Dilemma, where you can see many people. Pictured here is Tim Kendall, who used to be Facebook's head of monetization. And they are the very people who designed these systems, and they tell you that they can't escape their influences. The techniques we're talking about here are built on pre-attentive reactions. They're uncontrollable. The only thing that I can compare these with is subliminal advertising, which we know works, and we've outlawed it because we know it works. The other type of reaction I get is that people tell me, well, from what I've seen, Facebook isn't anything like what you describe it to be. And if that's what you think, it's because you're looking at your own feed. And the thing to remember is your Facebook feed is 100% personalized. It is completely unlike anyone else's. And there is just no way that you can look at what it shows and have any meaningful conclusions, any sweeping characterizations about what Facebook is. So with that out of the way, let's talk about how Facebook actually works. So this is the basic data science of Facebook influence. The first thing you need to do is you need to gather data. So let's take as an example, Trump's 2016 campaign. They had a database, it was called Project Alamo, and it contained identity profiles on 220 million people in America, practically every single voter in America. How did they get it? Well, they purchased the data. Facebook has certified marketing partners, and they purchase from them. We're talking about Experian and Datalogix and Epsilon and Axiom Corporation. So that gives you finance data and purchase data and demographic data and age and religion. And they added to that also Cambridge Analytica data, which gave them psychographics. And they took all of that and used Facebook's basic feature called lookalike hyper-targeting to bootstrap their campaign. So we are talking about tens of thousands of data attributes for almost every single voter in America. The Cambridge Analytica data alone is about 5,000 attributes. Axiom is another 11,000 attributes. There's a lot of data here. By the way, you may have heard about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and you may assume because of this that Cambridge Analytica was acting unethically and possibly illegally. I won't have time in a 1-hour talk to go over the Cambridge Analytica scandal, but let's say this. There is nothing that I see in what Cambridge Analytica did that is any different than any one of the certified marketing partners mentioned before. It is every bit as unethical as the rest of them and every bit as legal as the rest of them. Okay, so now you have data, and the next thing that you want to do is to start segmenting and mapping your population meaningfully. You want to measure things and see how the attributes that you have map to the things that you can measure. And as an example, let's talk about a study by Mikhail Kosinski and his team from 2013 called Private Traits and Attributes Are Predictable from Digital Records of Human Behavior. Digital records of human behavior, that is code name for Facebook likes. That's what they had. They didn't use anything else. They just used Facebook likes and only a handful of likes. They had an average of something like 50 likes for every person in their data set. And here's what they managed to do. The numbers here, if you look at this from a perspective of data scientists, they have correlation coefficients on the left, area under the curve on the right. These are metrics that we use in order to see how well you can predict something. And the answer is they can predict with incredible accuracy things like sexual orientation, ethnicity, religious and political views, personality traits, intelligence, happiness, use of addictive substances, parental separation, age, gender, and so much more, based on just a handful of likes, usually likes that not a single one of them has anything directly to do with any of what's measured. So we are all extremely transparent as soon as there's any feedback about us, and Facebook likes is a form of feedback about us. And you might think that they did this by some hyper complicated AI that nobody can possibly understand, and they didn't. Given that this is not an audience of data scientists, I won't go over the details of their entire model, but let's say this is the simplest model that a data scientist can produce. It just does not get any simpler than this. I have never seen in production anything quite as naive as this. And this is what they got with just that. And remember, they did this based on likes, roughly 50 likes. The Trump 2016 campaign worked on tens of thousands of attributes. And if Mark Zuckerberg wants to do it, he has gigabytes over gigabytes of data about every single user, which is about half of the entire human population. And the next thing that you do once you have all of these things is to start to experiment, because what you want is to optimize the stimuli that you give for every demographic. And usually when we talk about data science, we think about data science for marketing, because that's how we mostly use it these days. But the fact is that data science for political purposes came first. It's been around since at least 1959 when the Simulmatics Corporation did it and was considered a threat to democracy even back then. I should point out, political use of data science is in some ways even more natural than use for getting you to buy shampoos. Because if you use it to buy shampoos, you get a bit of a boost in the turnout and you get a bit more sales, and that's it. But democratic elections are a winner takes all game, and usually by design balanced on a knife's edge. So if you come in with a weapon that allows you to pull in one direction, even a small pull gives you total control over the result. And that's the scary bit. So what kind of experiments has Facebook itself been doing? Well, in 2010, they ran this experiment that they called the voter megaphone. And this is the experiment that really started my interest in this topic. I've been following it since around 2010 and have been talking about it since about 2012 and publishing about it since 2016. It's been part of my lectures at Monash since 2015 at least. So what is the voter megaphone? So it's an experiment that Facebook did in conjunction with the University of California, San Diego, where they took 61 million users and checked if they can affect their turnouts at the voting booths. And the way that they did that is on election day, they had this gray box, which is called the voter megaphone that you see here, appear on their feeds. And what it said was today is election day, and showed you a bunch of your friends, their pictures saying they voted, and gave you a little button to say that you voted. And by the way, use of your friends in this manner, use of your friends' pictures in this manner is one of the no-goes in the Facebook terms of service. This is one of those things that they allow themselves to do and pretty much nobody else does. And the fact that they have the button here where you are able to give them back feedback, this is what makes it truly dangerous. And this is why I was, my ears immediately perked up when I saw it. And this was amazingly successful. So they managed to show an uptick of over 340,000 votes based on that button. And they, in the paper that they published about this, they compared this with the 2000 US presidential elections, where the result ultimately was determined by only 537 votes in Florida. So yeah, 340,000 votes is way more than what you need in order to swing in elections. And Facebook has been using this button in every single US election since. It's been viewed by millions. It's been used in many elections outside of the US as well. They've been increasingly sophisticated with how they use it. They've been, learning a lot from these experiments. So for example, it turns out that it makes a huge difference who the Facebook friends that you see the pictures of are. Some friends will convince you a lot more than others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 2 years later, they had an experiment about political content in newsfeed. What they did was they took 1.9 million users and they tried to show not just that they could boost or suppress voter turnout, but also that what people do online spills off to offline behavior, actual attendance at the voting booth, for example. And they managed to show that if they up the political content in people's news streams, they managed to get an uptick in actual real world political behavior of entire percentages, which is unheard of. And yeah, again, more than enough to turn an election. Okay, so we have these experiments. The other thing that you do, and that's where social media is somewhat different than other places in data science, is that you target the influencers. This was started in earnest in Obama's 2008 campaign for presidency. And basically, they thought that they were doing some cost saving. Instead of trying to convince everyone, they will show the ads only to the key influencers. And the idea was touch thousands to move millions. So the influencers themselves will do the rest of the convincing for you. And that worked. That worked so well because what happened was that the impact looked from the outside like some grassroots movement. And it gave the Obama campaign so much momentum, so much headwind, that it became the blueprint for all subsequent social media political campaigns. The moral of the story here is nothing is grassroots. If ever you see the people rising up, the people are not rising up. That does not happen. The people are having the strings pulled. And to show that, here's another experiment. This one is from 2014. This was called the emotion contagion experiment, which for some reason Facebook for itself thought was going to be a good name. This is an experiment they did with Cornell University. Almost 700,000 users were involved. And what they did was they tweaked the newsfeed by giving people more or less happy news and more or less sad news. And what they saw is that not only does this impact the actual emotional state of the people who saw the newsfeed, it also impacted the emotional states of their Facebook friends. So this was contagious. And frankly, that wouldn't have surprised anyone. Remember the voter button that upped the votes by 340,000? Well, only 60,000 of those 340,000 actually saw the button. The rest is network effect. Now, from Facebook's perspective, this had a very, very clear business purpose. They want happy users. They don't want them too happy. They want them just happy enough so that they will start to click more and buy more, which is what happy users do. But if they become really happy, then they log off Facebook and start living their lives. And we don't want that. We want to keep them addicted and on the keyboard and working. So how to do that precisely is the purpose of the experiment. But the fact that it had this business purpose did not make this go down any easier for ethicists who complained bitterly that this had virtually no oversight, no ethical approvals. You couldn't opt out. There was no informed consent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the rest of the world's people who knew about this were also outraged. And to give you one example of a response to this, this is what Clay Johnson had to say about this at the time. He said, "The Facebook transmission of anger experiment is terrifying. Could Mark Zuckerberg swing an election by promoting Upworthy posts 2 weeks beforehand? Should that be legal? Could the CIA incite revolution in Sudan by pressuring Facebook to promote discontent? Should that be legal?" So two things about this. First, I don't know if it's something that should be legal, but I do know that both of these examples are basically things that have already happened since 2014. And the other thing that I want to say about this is Clay Johnson was the co-founder of the company that ran Obama's 2008 campaign, meaning that he was probably the person most with the clearest view of how he could use this technology to his own advantage. And instead of saying, "Oh, look what a shiny new toy, I want to use it," he is taking a step back and saying, "This is terrifying. This is going to be weaponized." And yeah, this was, again, about roughly the time in which I started publishing about it, because I completely agree. This is terrifying and would have been weaponized, and indeed immediately was weaponized. So let's start talking about that. Deception. Short history of disinformation. Propaganda has been around for centuries. The Vatican has had an office of propaganda from the 14th century on. The Russians are usually the ones who are credited for bringing it to the modern era. It's considered to be part of what they call active measures. In 2000 or so, they started something called web brigades. They employed users to post propaganda as comments on websites. And apparently they were pretty happy for that until around 2012, which you will recall is roughly the time that Facebook started publishing about its experiments. So from my perspective, they just looked at this toolkit that Facebook has developed and proved and said, we should probably use that. And they started doing something called computational propaganda. And a year later, in 2013, they founded the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, which despite its respectable name is actually a troll farm, funded by the Russian government, and is responsible for a large portion of the disinformation you guys have seen online. So if any of your friends believes something that is utterly ridiculous, you can, in many cases, thank the IRA for that. And specifically, they have used it for election meddling. How? Well, this is an analysis that was done in 2017 and published in 2017 about what the Russians were already doing back then. So elections can be meddled in many ways. Voters can be intimidated, which of course nowadays is quite common, all of the trolling behavior. They can be bribed. They can be the target of a disinformation campaign, which we'll soon talk about at length. Also, elections themselves can sometimes be hacked, usually not, but even if they can't be hacked, you can always create the perception that they were compromised, which is basically as good. And again, I can't see how this can possibly relate to anything that happened in 2020, because this is from 2017. That's about the hows. Let's talk about the whys. Turns out there are also multiple aims for election meddling. You can boost the turnout for a desired candidate. You can suppress other votes. You can split other votes. You can change voters' preferences. You can sow general confusion and distrust in the elections. The thing about this, which I think is really what explains everything for this topic from this point on, is that these things are not symmetric. Some of them, like suppressing or splitting votes, are very, very easy compared to others. And some of them, like changing voters' preferences, are very, very hard. So if you're wondering why politicians in the past used to be, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but by and large honest, and by and large trying to convince you to vote for them, and now you're seeing other things, that's because politicians used to do it in the hardest possible way. And now that we have all of the data technologies to show the bang for buck for all of the various ways, politicians have simply wisened up and are started to do it in the easy way, and are getting their seats by suppressing votes and splitting votes, telling you lies and convincing you not to come to the voting booth if they think you're gonna vote for their opponents. And as examples of the IRA doing this, well, ahead of the Democratic primaries for the 2000 US election, they split the vote by boosting Bernie Sanders, taking away votes from Joe Biden. Or in another campaign, they took selected votes that they thought were going to go to the competition and targeted them with a campaign that said, well, you can vote by text message. And of course, anybody who was fooled through that by that and sent a text message, an SMS to whatever address they asked to send, or whatever number they asked to send, that person did not show up at the voting booth and did not cast a legal vote. And that makes just the same effect as convincing somebody to vote for your candidate. If you want a an example from the Trump campaign. The 2016 Trump campaign, in its last few weeks alone, spent $150 million on a campaign that was almost universally negative in nature, so convincing people not to vote. They targeted a population of 3.5 million people, almost exclusively African Americans and women, and trying to get them to to not vote rather than trying to convince them to vote for them, which is going to be, of course, harder. Now, because there are all of these different hows and all of these different whys, it gets to be quite complicated to talk about this. So here's a theoretical model to explain all of this. It's called the Borden-Kopp model of deception. It dates back to 1999, again, based on what Russians have already been doing at that time. It talks about 5 different ways, actually 4 ways and 2 variants. Degradation has here 2 variants. And basically, it says everything that you do in terms of deception, you can map according to these 4.5 different dimensions. So you can hide your messages in noise, that's degradation. You can mimic a real message, that's fake news, that's corruption. You can cause your victims to never see what the opposition is saying, that's called denial. And you can get them to not believe what they're seeing, even if they are seeing it, that's called subversion. So to make this more concrete, let's talk about hyper-targeting. Here's how, so hyper-targeting is when you can get people to see things in a targeted way. So this population, I want to see this message, and then you might give a different population a different message. And the way that this works, it hacks into another cognitive bias of ours. When we see certain facts, say we're getting some facts from our Facebook feed, we make certain conclusions based on them, and we act in particular ways based on them. Now, if another person sees completely different Facebook feeds, gets different facts, and based on this gets different conclusions and acts in different ways, our brains are not wired to say, oh, their Facebook feed must be different. Instead, what we're wired to say is, they're making these decisions that make no sense to me based on the facts that I have. Therefore, I do not trust their judgment. There must be something wrong with them. And this method of telling one population one thing and another thing makes it very easy to use deception in pretty much every dimension here. You can break down true communications, that's corruption. You can obviously build distrust between populations, that's subversion. You can promise different things to different people and scare different populations about different things. That's denial, because I don't know what you were promised. I don't know what you were scared about. And in fact, this is not just a problem for individuals. This is a problem also at the level of the regulator. There are voices that say that some of the Facebook messages that the Trump campaign used in 2016 did not comply with federal law. And there's no way to check those claims because Facebook refuses to say what the messages were, how many they were, who saw which message, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing we really know is that these messages sent people to over 100,000 different websites that had 100,000 different creative contents, truly promising different things. Finally, you can have degradation, which means that you confuse the issue by introducing irrelevancies and one-day rage campaigns. So irrelevancies is when you get people to care about things that are not relevant at all to your topic, makes them care less about your topic. And we know how that works. Specifically, it's easiest to get people worked up all about one topic at a given time, just cheapest to do, which is why we're getting these one-day rage campaigns or the cancel culture campaigns or all of these things. Now, hyper-targeting is not just for deception, of course. Its main issue is personalization, and the most direct impact of that is creating echo chambers and filter bubbles. I assume you've heard these names before, but let me explain them anyway. So whenever there's any topic, there's going to be some opinion spectrum around it. But when you are online, you don't see that spectrum. The algorithm decides what news to show you, and it only picks a much narrower spectrum to show you based on where you are, what it thinks you would want to see. And originally this was meant because social media companies wanted to show you news that would be interesting and relevant to you. The algorithms pounced on it because of yet another bias in our brain, confirmation bias. When we hear something that we already believe, it makes us happier. So we wanted the happy users. This is what we do. We give them the news they already know rather than try to show them what else is out there in the world. Now, in the context of deception, this can be used in multiple ways. The first thing that you can do is that you can manipulate opinions by using a false appearance of a consensus as an attractor. What does that mean? Well, supposing that my opinion is the circle over there, and I am seeing the opinions that I'm seeing, so the apparent consensus is approximately where the dashed line is. That's what I think the opinion consensus is. So I have a natural tendency to try and compensate for that and be slightly more average in my opinion. But then you can move your filter and I will follow. And that's something that bots have been using in what we call adversarial machine learning campaigns. So the IRA and others have deployed bots that just spout this one view over and over and over again that creates a particular appearance of a consensus. It's a false consensus. The filter bubble homes in on it, and then they just walk the filter bubble and walk you with it. So that's how you manipulate opinions. The other thing that you can do is you can artificially create an us versus them dynamic. So when I see only a very narrow cross-section of views, anything that is outside of that cross-section is something that I would think is alien, it's foreign. Nobody in my tribe could possibly say that or think that, which is a way to make people disregard other people's opinions, consider them the enemy, and feel a psychological need to defend their positions and barricade themselves into them, which of course leads to polarization, which is excellent for marketing, but not for society at large. Which brings us to 2018, when the Borden-Kopp model was updated by the Kopp-Korb-Mills model that added another layer to it. Before we just had an information theoretic model, now we have a game theoretic version, a layer on top of that. So now we're talking about compound attacks and stateful victims. What that means is instead of just saying, I'm going to have this one attack that I will follow, this one strategy that I will follow, hyper-targeting allows me to personalize. I know what each one of the people on Facebook needs right now in order to be convinced. So I can give each person a personalized pathway in order to get them to where I want them to be. And for example, that means I might start off by increasing the noise to get them less certain, but then once they are uncertain, then I can start giving them the fake news and convince them of what I want to convince them. Most importantly about this is Facebook has what's called a small world graph. That means everybody's a friend of a friend of a friend. And we tend to trust our friends. The fact that everybody is a friend of a friend of a friend doesn't matter. Our brains are wired to trust our friends. And if we get our news from a friend, we tend to believe it, which is why one of the things that you do in this form of attack is you can convince a victim to become your own megaphone, and they start convincing others. And if you remember the idea of touch thousands in order to convince millions, that is now being used on a grand scale everywhere. What Kopp, Korb, and Mills showed is that you can have very, very small amounts of fake news integrated into the graph, and they will spread like wildfire. And that's not just a theoretical result. It has been verified experimentally. Falsehoods are propagated faster and wider and deeper and reach hundreds of times more people. It's scary just how effective lies are. And again, that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because if we were talking about the Facebook feed being addictive, and that's sort of an analogy to it being a drug, people who are pushing these kinds of deception campaigns, they're not just pushing a drug, they're pushing a designer drug. These are messages that have been carefully crafted in order to make them maximally propagatable, and not just maximally propagatable, also maximally believable. And just to give you an example of something like this, what you see here is a Google Trends graph for, believe it or not, flat eartherism. And there just wasn't any flat eartherism until not so long ago. And then suddenly, whoops, it goes up, and whoops, it goes down. And if you ask me, and I'll offer here my own little conspiracy theory on this topic, this looks controlled to me. This looks like somebody planted this idea of flat eartherism and is just experimenting to see how well that propagates in various channels. So lies not only propagate better, they stick better. This is because of yet other biases in our brain, like memory misattribution. We tend to say that we heard things from our friends even when we didn't, when we heard them from elsewhere. So if you know about Nicki Minaj's cousin's friend and their experience in Trinidad from the COVID vaccine, there was no cousin, there was no friend. Nobody in Trinidad had any of that kind of experience, but Nicki Minaj has misattributed it to one of her cousins, and now we all heard it from her, and many people believe her because she said it. Again, we tend to believe our friends, and there are many other effects that combine in this. For example, illusion of truth. When we hear something more than once, especially if we forgot where we heard it, the second time we tend to believe it. So these are techniques that are using well-known cognitive biases. And they're very easy and they're very cheap. How cheap? Well, the Russians used to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to buy US PR companies in order to convince, to lobby politicians in Washington. And they no longer do that because they figured out that in using tens of thousands of dollars, they can get the same effect by convincing all of the rest of us. And it's so cheap that it immediately spurned global copycats. The number of governments that are now doing this rose threefold from 2017 to 2020. Everybody you see here in dark blue is doing it. In fact, governments no longer even just do it themselves. 48 governments as of 2020 outsource it to private companies. I said that a single campaign, 20K is enough. Well, they're spending tens of millions of dollars on it this year alone, combined these 81 countries. And there are currently 65 firms in the world that offer computational propaganda as a service. And over $60 million has been spent on this since 2009. This is an industry now, disinformation. And you may notice that Australia is in a dark blue color. I won't go into too many details here, but let's say a year ago when I last gave this talk, we were rated as a lightweight player in this, still a player, but a lightweight player. Now we've upgraded to medium. We are doing basically everything. We're just not doing it very well yet. And well, some punches we're still pulling. I don't know for how long. So let's talk about political bias in Facebook, because everybody likes to know that. I call that the easy story. We're talking about the US context. So is Facebook biased? Well, what is bias? Demographics of Facebook are biased. Facebook has people who are, by and large, young, tend to female, tend to be highly educated, college degree, tend to be urban dwellers. So all of these things correlate with politics because everything does. And specifically, all of the things that I just mentioned correlate with a liberal leaning. So the Facebook demographics are heavily liberal leaning. Also, sharing practices are not the same between Democrats and Republicans, between liberals and conservatives. So how do you even do something that is not is unbiased? And by the way, when you have this kind of skew, it is not necessarily skewing things in the direction you think. The fact that there are more liberal leaning in people in Facebook doesn't make it easier for liberals. It makes it easier for Republicans. If I'm a Republican and I want to influence people, remember the easiest thing is to suppress votes. So whose votes do I want to suppress? I want to suppress the votes of the liberals. So I have a lot more people that I can try to influence. Okay, so how do you determine if what Facebook is doing is skewed or not, given that from the get-go, everything is skewed? And what I like to do is I like to look at what choices they had and what choices they made. So in May 2016, an ex-employee of Facebook came out as a whistleblower, said the trending feature is based on human editorial decisions and it is skewed liberally and it is inconsistent. Different editors make different decisions. I have no doubt that they were correct because these were people in the San Francisco Bay Area. They tend to be liberal, and of course they're inconsistent, they're human. And Facebook's immediate reaction was to just fire that entire staff and replace them by an algorithm instead. Was that the correct choice? I don't think they really had much choice in the matter because, well, first off, they lied about it. They originally said that the trending feature was fully automated. So that put them in a bit of hot water. So that was the original sin probably. But also, they really need to not be regulated. So much of what they do hinges on the fact that they don't have the kind of regulation that a news corporation has. They say, I'm just a platform. So it's very important for them to not appear like they're meddling with the news. From my perspective as a data scientist, it doesn't matter if they're meddling through human editors or through bots that have in turn been programmed by humans. Either way is an editorial decision. Either way introduces a bias. The fact that they took the humans out of the loop actually had other costs. What it meant was that the editors, now automatic editors, didn't have any context to work off of. They couldn't tell fake news from real news, which meant that the IRA bots immediately pounced on this with an adversarial machine learning campaign, started pumping Facebook full of fake news, and the fake news started trending. It's been trending ever since. And that was really the blueprint of everything that came after that, because what we saw is that you can control more and get more liberal views, or you can let the internet do its thing and be inundated with fake news that was predominantly Republican. And because Facebook really wanted to be on the good side of Republicans, they didn't want to be regulated. They hired Joel Kaplan to become VP Global Public Policy. And he has since, in practically every year, took very important project like Project P, P for Propaganda, that was after the 2016 election, trying to work against fake news. Every year there was a major project that could have made a huge difference in how Facebook worked, and he killed it because he argued, probably correctly, that it would disproportionately harm conservatives. This is what Facebook is like now, and the whole story in 2 quotes is that in 2014, after the emotion contagion experiment, Sheryl Sandberg, number 2 in Facebook, said Facebook would never try to control elections, whereas 6 years later, Alex Tamas, ex-chief security officer at Facebook, says, I think Facebook is looking at their political advertising policy in explicitly partisan terms. The Republicans in the DC office see themselves as a bulwark against the liberals in California. So let me summarize this for you. Who wins an election is really decided by a handful of people in Facebook. It's a small war inside of Facebook for the heart and mind of one Mark Zuckerberg. And anybody else who's voted makes very, very little difference. That's the easy choice. That's the easy story. The hard story is this. I don't think this easy story really answered the questions if we look at it at a global scale, because the whole idea that Facebook are doing this because of political expediency, well, why are we saying what we're saying in Myanmar and Assam and South Sudan, apropos Clay Johnson, and Papua and Zimbabwe? All of these are places where there was very well concentrated, very well coordinated and funded disinformation campaigns by bots that sow divisions, incited violence, and ultimately caused genocide. Why is this in Facebook's interest? And if you think that it's inevitable, well, no, because recent studies have shown that while Facebook makes people more partisan polarized, Reddit makes them more moderate, and Twitter has no effect. And the original article explains why, I mean, in terms of the decisions in Facebook's design, but I want to dig a bit deeper. Why were these design choices in Facebook made to begin with? So what does Facebook optimize for? In order to see what Facebook optimizes for, let's look at what moved them and what didn't move them. So here are things that didn't move Facebook's policies. When the Facebook staff staged a virtual walkout, nothing changed. When 5 members of the board left between mid-2019 and mid-2020, nothing changed. On the other hand, when they had some bad PR or some public backlash, they said, oh, we'll do better. And then either made a point-wise change or didn't make any change at all. You can see, by the way, what I said before about Myanmar, etc. That's not me saying it. That's a Facebook commission, an internal commission by Facebook, reached these conclusions that Facebook was the one doing it. And after they came with their conclusions, the Facebook senior management said, oh, we didn't know we had this power. We will now never do this again. We will make sure that Facebook is never used again for disinformation campaigns and to polarize populations and to make people distrust elections. Apparently, they don't read the news. So point change and nothing else, or platitude and nothing else. I can give other examples too. But here are things that did change Facebook policies in major ways. When politicians suspended advertising, when politicians threatened regulations, and most noticeably of all, when Unilever decided to pull its advertising and a few other advertisers followed suit and boycotted Facebook, immediately causing an 8% drop in share price, like that. Immediately, in a snap, Facebook started fact-checking politicians, which they adamantly refused to do beforehand, at a time in which, by the way, Twitter was doing it long ago. And just to complete the picture, neither Twitter nor Google ever allowed politicians to do hyper-targeting to begin with, which Facebook still does. So the answer is Facebook maximizes its value for shareholders, which in turn is about maximizing ad revenue, which is their main income. And that means number of relevant users, time spent on Facebook by users, engagement of users with Facebook material, predictability of users' responses, ease of swaying users. And not only are these the things that they maximize for, they have very fine control over it. I can tell you in which year how these were sorted, what weight they give to each. And the problem with these is that all of them benefit from a hyper-polarized environment. If you get people polarized, they get scared, they get angry, they call in their friends to join the good fight, they spend more hours, they're more invested in the material. And of course, because they're polarized, their opinions are with less of a spectrum, more of a, to more of a Boolean behavior, so they're much more predictable. And of course, people who are scared are so easy to sway. So it's just perfect. In the words of Randall Munroe, this is important. Someone is wrong on the internet. So in conclusion, or as I like to call it, an unnecessarily inflammatory slide pushing disputed content that will make this talk go viral. Facebook has programmed an AI to maximize its revenue by large-scale social engineering. The AI discovered that profits are maximal when the world is in flames, and the rest is history. Now, you can't push this genie back in the bottle. That's not how technology works. But the thing is, normally, regulation steps in at this point. I mean, from the Industrial Revolution on, there's always been a tension between what's good for a company and what's good for its users or society at large. And what makes all of this work is regulation. And when there aren't any heavy lobbies, regulation is generally good. When there's a strong lobby group, regulation is generally bad. This is a particularly interesting case because users can't push for regulation because we're all addicted. Facebook won't push for regulation because it is this very data-driven attitude that got it to where it is to begin with. I mean, this is a company that, based on data-driven decisions, have developed this massive engine that, remember, it doesn't just make huge amounts of money. It also consumes $65 billion a year. When you've got something, when you've got a beast that eats up $65 billion a year, you really, really don't want to tinker with it, especially when tinkering with it means abandoning the one principle that built it to begin with. And lastly, and this is where it gets really interesting, politicians are not pushing for regulations, not because there are any strong lobby groups, but because politicians are the lobby groups. Politicians are the ones who are benefiting from all of this. And they're part of the game, and they're not abandoning it just because it's really, really detrimental to society. And if you want to see just how little influence we have over all of this, remember that slowly rising, slowly falling graph for flat eartherism? Well, here's the comparable Google Trends graph for something else. This is for the hashtag delete Facebook, which trended in 2014 after the emotion contagion experiment. And just look how it's trending. It spiked, and then immediately that spike went down, it was gone, it was forgotten, and never spoken about again. That's what happens when you've got a trend that social media doesn't like to amplify. And I could speak about this for hours more, but I'm already over time, so I will close at that and open the floor for questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very interesting. Rob Brown in the control booth, if anyone's got their hand up to ask a question, you could allocate them to ask the question. Joe Gold, have you got a question?
Sorry, Peter, I think Kirsten now has a question for us. She's got her hand up.
Kirsten?
Thank you so much for that, Michael. My question is, do you see any solution? We here have like about 1,400-1,500 members of people that fell in love, many of us, with computers when, about 40 years ago, when we would never have seen this sort of stuff happening. What advice do you give to us for what we can do?
Push for regulation. I think regulation is possible. We have seen regulation with things like subliminal advertising. We have regulation. I mean, when your kids don't see advertisement for things in their Saturday morning cartoons. We can regulate this. It's not technologically impossible. You can redesign Facebook in a way that will not be this harmful. You can separate the news feed from the other feeds. You can boost things not based on MSI, which is
we've lost your sound, Michael. Can you unmute? Can you unmute, Michael?
Can you
yes,
hear me
we
now?
Can hear you. Yes.
I don't know why it said the host muted you.
Accident,
Maybe the host just muted everyone. Facebook has some metrics called MSI. They've been optimizing for MSI since 2018. That's called meaningful social interaction. And based on that, for example, since 2018, they started upping things that make people actually write comments instead of just like, that kind of thing. And the thing about it is they know that meaningful social interaction is maximized by fake news. When we have the disinformation campaigns, when we have the lies, we share more, we comment more, we're more invested. They have that as something that they optimize for. And Mark Zuckerberg knows this. He's mentioned this in public comments. But also, since Frances Haugen's exposure of internal Facebook documents, we know that in April 2020, Mark Zuckerberg had in his office a proposal to fight disinformation about the COVID vaccine. Not just about the COVID vaccine, about COVID. And their analysis said that they could reduce this by 38%. And he said, nope, I don't want to do this because it will lower MSI. So the point in which we are able to say that is socially acceptable behavior, that should be allowed and legal. I think there's an issue there, and I think we can't just go on saying they are a public company and they can do whatever they want. We don't allow that in terms of health and safety for employees, and we shouldn't allow it in terms of health and safety for users.
Rob, there's two others with their hand up.
Yeah, Peter, we've got a question here from Richard. Richard Bradford, do you want to unmute?
Yeah. Do you see the Australian electoral system being a little bit more immune to a couple of those Facebook techniques because of preferential voting and compulsory voting?
I'm repeatedly asked this question. So the fact that we have compulsory voting is great, because it means that we don't have the huge move towards voter suppression. In the US, millions of votes are regularly suppressed in multiple ways. Some of them are the ways we discussed, and other ways have nothing to do with it. And that kind of thing we don't see in Australia, but that doesn't mean that we're any more resilient. You can split the vote, and that works just as well. You can sow confusion, and by this split the votes, for example, and that works just as well in a democratic system. The problem is, from my perspective, that these disinformation campaigns and these social manipulation techniques, they themselves are preferential in terms of in which direction they push us. Because if you had two politicians in exactly the same situation, let's say that the Facebook users were exactly symmetric and the sharing behavior was exactly symmetric. Let's say that a political opinion didn't change any of the social behavior. it would still be the case that the kind of disinformation campaign we're talking about here is a lot more effective when what you're pushing for is fascism and xenophobia and separatism. So if you happen to be on the right end of the scale, you're getting so much headwind from these techniques, and I think this is partly why we're seeing all over the world the right wing on the rise and democracy in a decline. It's very, very important that a loser in an election will think that keeping the democratic system alive is more important than winning, because democracy is not very resilient to the opposite kind of behavior. Now, at the moment in Australia, we've got politicians who, like I said, are still holding back some punches. So, for example, we've seen that we've seen disinformation campaigns, but the disinformation campaigns are either trying to convince you to vote for a candidate or try to attack the opposition, say various bad things about them that will make you want to disassociate with them and not vote for them, which, you know, many times are not true. These are bad. Don't get me wrong. These are bad, but it gets much worse when you do things like create noise, or even worse, create polarization, because that's what we are seeing right now in the US, and we can see it. There's nothing stopping us from seeing it in Australia. And the problem I see with that is that while this may win you an election, it's a scorched earth policy for winning an election. We've seen that quite dramatically in Brexit. You can get people to vote for what you want them to vote, but what you can't do is, after you've done that even once, get back to a point where there is meaningful social discourse. There is no way for a person to have an informed decision in an election if they can't actually have the discourse to make their opinions informed, if what they're seeing is false choices. And unfortunately, nothing in preferential voting or even in mandatory voting, compulsory voting, is immune to that kind of thing.
At least preferential voting makes us a little bit more immune to the splitting the vote technique. In other words, that an extremist is less likely to be able to win out by a split vote. Because the split is likely to go to combine back on preferences back to the more moderate view.
Can we just have the second question, Rob? We're running out of time.
Yes, Peter, I've got a couple of comments in the chat I might read out. From Lewis, I've never been a Facebook fan, and now this has been reinforced. From Steph, I have the us versus them resonated with me. We'll now refer to this in future as slide 31 technique. Steph also says, Michael, thank you for joining many perceived dots, and especially in how local Australian politicians play the craft to self-benefit. The old honest politician is definitely something of the past. Your insight is empowering and a godsend. I've got a comment from Joe Gold. I might ask Joe to unmute and see if he can tell us what his question is. Are you there, Joe? I think he's got a comment in relation to government regulated advertising that perhaps he can clarify.
Joe Gold, are you there?
Sorry, I got distracted. There was a recent campaign done by the current Australian government about advertising costs in Facebook and other medias. Have you got any comment on that in general?
Yeah, I was very, very, very hopeful for that. We were in a position to be able to do something really great and be a world first to actually meaningfully I wouldn't say control what social media is doing, but at least give them some costs to a small fraction of what they're doing. And yeah, I really loved that idea, and I was supporting it throughout. And then 24 hours before the final version of the law was drafted, the big social media players apparently managed to influence, to exert enough force on our politicians to make them gut out that entire law and make it completely meaningless. And in fact, not just meaningless, but actually giving them more headwind to do more of what they've already been doing, because in the final formulation of the law, the smaller players, which are the ones that this law was meant to protect, are in fact damaged. They're harmed.
We might leave the Zoom questions. Is there anyone in the room got a question briefly? We're running over time.
That should work. Oh, that'll work. I hope you can hear me, Michael. Not if you can.
I can.
Good. Michael, I'll face the camera. I'm a little bewildered about this because I'm a very avid Facebook user, but I don't think I see much of this false news and what have you. Is that because maybe I only have people I know as friends, and I only subscribe to a limited number of mainly technical groups within Facebook? I do get some advertising, but most of that is just rubbish anyhow, so I just delete it. And if I've been online looking for orange juice, I'll suddenly get 5 ads for orange juice coming up on my feed, but that's fairly insignificant. So what am I missing here about people getting most of their news off Facebook and most of their information off Facebook? Is it just the angry masses or what?
This is a great question. And again, goes back to what you see on your own personal feed is extremely not representative. What this means is not that you're somehow shielded from this. You're absolutely not. You would have gotten the false information from your friends. Now, what this means is that Facebook does not actually consider you a demographic that they would want to influence in one way or the other in any specific campaign. So for example, why try to give you false news ahead of US elections if you are not a US voter? Okay, so this is hyper-targeting. It's extremely specific. I can tell you that many of my friends are of the kind that only has very few people whom they know as their Facebook friends and only subscribe to very, very limited channels, but they are still currently bombarded by anti-vax disinformation if they haven't yet vaccinated. If they already have vaccinated, poof, that goes away. I want to, by the way, I see here the other questions in the chat. There is a question that came from Ian Baker that I do want to address. Ian writes, I don't think this is all that new. Whoever has controlled the media has always won the election. It is just new tools that are still evolving, question mark. Yes and no. Yeah, sure. If you were in control of the news, you had a lot of impact before, and you know, George Orwell said it best. If you control the past, you control the future. If you control the future, you control the present. Absolutely. But still, what you couldn't do before is the hyper-personalization, and what you couldn't do before is the stateful attacks. If Rupert Murdoch decides to boldly lie to the people, then it's one lie and it's told to all of the people, and that lie can be checked, can be fact checked. You can build a social layer of antibodies around that, but you can't do it in Facebook because you have no idea what messages are being sent and to whom. And the messages are entirely crafted to you and to make you move in the one direction that is most conducive for whoever is spreading the news right now to influence you. Uncomparable. It's like one is, yeah, it's dangerous, but it's a Tommy gun, and we're talking about an atomic bomb.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. We might finish there. My wife says don't say the same thing every week, but I found that extremely interesting. But I only have a couple of comments. I'd like to be able to hack into Facebook and see what they have on me. My family, my children and my grandchildren think I live in the smallest, dumbest, boringest bubble you could imagine. So I doubt that Facebook would have much on me.
Facebook has gigabytes on you. I invite you to use their feature that allows you to ask them what they have on you. They do have this feature because government, federal regulation requires them to have it. They give it in a format that is completely useless. There's just no way that you can actually do anything with it, but you will see that they have gigabytes on you.
I'll pass it on to my grandson who's into all this sort of thing, and he can find out about Grandpa. The other thing is that when you were talking about emotion contagion, you talked about people that they go out and click and buy, but you don't want them very happy. Well, you've proved to me that I'm very happy. I don't click and buy. So look, thank you very much, Michael, and we much appreciate it. So for those present, we're going to have a 20-minute break for you. And there'll be some music played, and then Kirsten's going to do her presentation. Don't forget the raffle. Choi and John are out there selling tickets. And there's a bottle of wine that was donated by Marlon, our secretary, is she our personal helper? Or yeah, so thanks very much for Marlon for that. And following the meeting, there's the waffle cig, a few things. So just have 5 minutes break and we'll see you waffle people in 5 minutes time. I'll now hand over to our president, David Stonier Gibson, to give us a rundown on what's happening.
Done nothing to deserve that yet. Organised here, as you can see. Have my notes. Michael, if you're still out there, thank you for your talk. That was really good. Welcome back, and maybe we'll see you in future. I also want to thank Kirsten. This is the last meeting that Kirsten will have been doing the organisation of, and she's been doing a superb job. And now she's dumped it back on me. So if anyone here would like to assist in organising the meetings, that would be great. I think one of the best things Kirsten has been doing is a very nice, tight running sheet, which is not my kind of thing. I can find speakers fairly effectively, I think, but I'm not very good at organising running sheets and so on. So if there's anyone who'd like to work with me on organising these meetings, I'd love to hear from you. The transition from Microsoft to Google is well underway. Harry's going to be saying more about that in a little while. So all I'm going to say is that at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., the big switch is going to be thrown and we will be on Google. There's also, so the next things that come up on the transition are the OneDrive storage, about which I'm going to say nothing. The other is our social media, which is currently Yammer. We've been evaluating a couple of what's the word, platforms for our social media. One is Google Currents, and the other is HubHub. Now, there's no decision been made. It's still wide open. There's some discussion about it on Yammer, and every member is welcome to join in and have their say. But certainly currently the short list is Google Currents and HubHub, with Google Currents being in front simply because it can be implemented without any extra administrative burden, and that's a really important factor. Just a couple of words. The library of things that I'm in the process of aspiring to establish, shall we say, it's still a bit of an ambition. I have been doing a bit of work, and I'm sort of resuming a bit of work on that as we emerge out of lockdown. The cupboards in the maker room, as it's now called, used to be the training room. We need to free those up for storing library stuff in, so there's a process beginning to take place there. Another matter, some of you will be aware of the ASCCA, or ASCA as they call themselves, which is a sort of a body that looks after the computing needs of senior people and they seniors. Used to be largely based in Sydney. They went through some ructions over COVID, and they had a flood in their headquarters in Sydney. And as a consequence of that, they're now decentralized, including having their secretary working from home here in Melbourne. I reached out to them recently, and I just to tell you this, I reached out to them recently to say if there's anything with our rather nice facilities we can offer to assist ASCA with, we'd be only too happy to. It turns out during the lockdown, during COVID, they have been very, very good for our members. A lot of our members have taken advantage of their online courses in various subjects, and we in turn have been their biggest clients for their online courses. So there's a natural compatibility there. So the outcome of that offer was that, thank you, we're pretty right as it is right now, but it's still there on the table. Short apology for not having done a report in the newsletter this month, but that would have come out yesterday anyhow, so you've got it now verbally. And finally, hope to see you at the waffles later on after the meeting. Thank you. Now you can clap.
Thank you for that, David. So now I'll pass over to Harry Lewis. I hope Harry's live there somewhere, and Harry's our iHelp representative. For those who I'm sure most of you know, but Matthew may not know, but we have a team of helpers, and Harry's one of the iHelp team. So if you've got a question, Harry is only too happy to answer it. So if there's any questions, I suggest you raise your hand. Over to you, Harry.
Thank you, Chairman. As the President said, I think I'd like to start just by reminding everybody where we've got to with the transition to the new Google Workspace service. And then I'll pause for questions on that. And then I'll pause for questions on anything else that might be addressed to iHelp. So we announced the cutover of new mail into Google for today, but we actually put back the event itself until very early tomorrow, mainly to make sure that the mail out that Hugh McDonald sent out this afternoon would still reach as many members as possible, because we could see, we know what your favorite address is for sending mail outs, and of the members who've chosen their MelbPC address, there's still 150 who, according at least to the Google reporting, haven't yet accessed their new account. So we thought it'd be nice if they got the mail out. Then we've got 2 months for them to catch up. Now, I expect most people here are pretty clear about this, but we are dealing daily with members who need a little more support. The change is, as they say in the MX record in the DNS settings, for mail to addresses at melbpc.org.au. Currently, the wide world is told that any email directed to that domain arrives at our Microsoft service. Sometime early tomorrow, I'll come back to how long it might take in a moment, the world will find out and act on our instruction that those messages need to go directly to our accounts in Google Workspace. Our Microsoft accounts will not see them anymore. Up to now, the Microsoft accounts have been forwarding to the new service, so you got them in both inboxes. About how long it takes, apparently the default assumption for the message getting around the planet to all the servers is 24 hours. But our vice president has told us that he's seen it work in 2 hours. So as long as you're receiving mail in the new system, you won't notice any difference unless you're very careful to scrutinize the way the mail has come in. If you're listening to this and you're using your MelbPC email address as a regular matter and you haven't yet accessed the new system, you need to take action fairly promptly. The support team has been working exceptionally hard over the past few days with members who want to catch up. Some of them have never ever logged in, although they've had the account for sometimes over a year. Some of them have logged in and somehow it slipped their mind that they did it. And so they need a gentle reminder from us, and often nothing more than encouragement to go and use the lost password system for Google. That said, again, probably not much needed in this company. It's important to mention that this is affecting only the email aspect of our service with Microsoft. As our president has just reminded us, there are several other aspects of the service which impact individual members. If you're using OneDrive, if you're going to Yammer, or indeed if you're logging into our WordPress system, which hosts the website, and also that's how you renew your membership online or tell us you've changed your address. Those are still in the pipeline, and it will take weeks rather than days before all that is done. So I'm now going to pause for any questions at all from present company. I see Richard Purdy has a hand up. I assume that's deliberate, Richard. You need to unmute yourself if you want to talk, Richard. I can see you muted. Now you're unmuted.
I just have a general question. Is that in order?
Of course.
Yeah, it's nothing to do with the MelbPC mail. I just have a friend who once connected, once an old Canon printer, BJC 255SP, connected to a Windows 10 computer. In the absence of any appropriate Windows 10 drivers, is it possible? Or do I tell them to just throw it out and get a new one?
Personally, I have no idea, except I have been assisting a member with a very new printer, even to get it connected at all. It was a Hewlett-Packard, and it was a very stressful thing for both of us. In my limited experience of supporting members with printers, this is the Wild West of modern computing, compared with the comparative order we find even in the world of Windows, which after all has to satisfy all the different kinds of hardware, let alone in the Apple world where everything is very much tidier in that respect. But printers, annoyingly, all have different user interfaces, so it's almost impossible to help a member blind, and you can't share their printer screen with them. But when we come to age of supporting printers, I did, as it happens, when I was talking to my member about the Hewlett-Packard printer, I did a bit of Googling, or web searching as I should call it, and I did find advice on using outdated drivers with that particular combination. I completely failed to satisfy the member on that basis, but I think that, look, others, if you're lucky, somebody here has actually been there, Richard, and I'll pause to see if they have. But otherwise, I think the usual thing is you hope that there are enough people on the planet that have done it before you. And if you can choose the right magic words, somebody will, you'll come across a chat room. One thing to talk about might be the chat room for the printer manufacturer, except they never support old printers directly. But if you can get to the chat room, if there's a fan club out there, you might find something there. But I'll pause there in case anybody else can help further.
Yes, Harry. Dave here from iHelp. Quite often Microsoft will have a generic driver that will suit the printer. So if that also fails, you can pick that up by connecting the printer and running Windows Update, or go to the manufacturer's site and query the printer number. And there's a good chance that you'll be able to get the drivers that way. That's it.
Thanks, Dave.
No worries.
Any more offers? Beat that if you dare.
I should add, this printer's that old, it has the old parallel cable interface, but I managed to obtain a parallel to USB cable connection.
Well done. Yeah. I suspect that should be okay, shouldn't it? I mean, it's the language that's coming through the connection, not the shape of the actual plug, isn't it?
Yes.
Parallel's very old.
Yes.
So good luck.
Any more on Richard's question? Any other questions or observations about the Google email? Oh, Cedric, sorry. You're muted, Cedric. Right.
Yeah, I can't give you a lot of details, but there is some other crowd, and I can't remember their name right now. So once more, it might be a case of trying to find the right words for a Google search. But I think there is some third-party supplier of drivers who will often have a driver for something where Microsoft don't, where there isn't a Microsoft compatible server. I'm afraid I can't give you much more than that. This is just a long while ago, and I've forgotten the name of the organisation that supplies those drivers.
Thanks, Cedric. Is John Thompson, John? Again, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks for that, Harry. A couple of questions. One is, I've been using Thunderbird for more years than I can remember.
Right.
And the changeover seems to have just gone swimmingly.
Right,
now
good.
I'm getting all this information about I need to log in with Google. Do I have to, or does Thunderbird just do it all automatically?
No, look, the situation is conceptually, if I can say that, exactly like that with Microsoft. So they both provide a web interface to their email service, and then you're talking effectively directly to the server. So there's no intermediary. But then those two interfaces have different strengths and weaknesses. But they also, I mean, just about any email provider worth their salt provides tools so that you can use POP IMAP. And of course, if it's Microsoft Exchange, which is Microsoft proprietary, but Exchange is supported, it's supported by many providers on mobile devices. So there's no problem at all with using Thunderbird with Google. There's a tiny advantage. I should have mentioned this, so I forgot to mention this before. Probably the most significant challenge to us all over the next few days, or it might be weeks for you, depending where you sit in this, is that you're bound to use the new Google Workspace, GWS service to see your new mail to your MelbPC account. But if you were migrated some time ago, or even 2 weeks ago, the rest of what were your folders in Microsoft and are now labels in Google are frozen in time. It's like a backup system. There's a forwarding that's been topping up your inbox, but the other folders are out of date. We are planning, I think I can say this with confidence now, it took a bit of thinking around this one, to update everybody a final time. But everybody is over 1,000 accounts and we can't do them overnight. So for the interim period, if you want to find an email that you received within the last X, and the easiest way to figure out what X might be, if you're looking freshly at your Google mail, is to look at the sent folder. However assiduous you are in storing email in different folders, most of us haven't done much about sent, and it's likely to be frozen in time. If you haven't yet used the Gmail program service, if you picked it up, let's say 4 weeks ago, you might still see a gap of 3 months between 4 weeks ago and when it was actually migrated. So if we want to find those mails until the final update, we're going to need to look back at the old account. This can be done by webmail in Outlook, of course, Outlook on the web. If you've got Thunderbird, it lets you have accounts open for both of the services. Microsoft Desktop Outlook is much more particular, and we're getting confusingly different responses from it. So all I can say is it isn't always the case that you're allowed to have a second account with the same email address. I came across this just this afternoon in supporting a member in setting up. How am I doing, John?
Well, I don't really feel that I've made a lot of progress. What I was trying to say is that Thunderbird seems to be working perfectly.
Yes.
Do I need to do anything about Google?
As long, well, it will, here's the, up to, actually, I can even try it after the meeting, but I can't do it for more than 2 members. Until the cutover happens, which is likely to start at 6 a.m., depending when somebody gets out of bed, we can send a message that will only arrive at the new account.
Yep.
I think that would still work, but the point is, if you're looking at an account and you're not sure which it's pointing to, you can do it that way. But there's a slightly easier way to do it that I rather suspect, John, you're entirely capable of. You look at the server you're using, right? And if it says something like gmail.com in it, you're talking to Google. And if it says something like outlook.office365.com, you're certainly talking to Microsoft.
Yeah, well, I do have another little problem in that I do have some non-MelbPC Outlook accounts, but they seem to be coming through. Anyway, leave that.
Oh, don't we all, John? I won't tell you how many I've got.
Leave that question for the time being. The next question is that I keep getting a blue panel coming up from Microsoft, I think, saying sign in required. Your device is having problems with your work or school account. Sign in again to access your organization's resources, and learn more at aka.ms/account recovery. Sign in now or later.
John, have you noticed any problem accessing your different Microsoft accounts, actually using them?
Well, I'm not using the Microsoft. I haven't noticed any Thunderbird problems using.
Well, nor have I. I get that message every day.
Yeah.
I have one suspicion. Is your PC by any chance using a local login and not a Microsoft login? Have you?
You mean with the user accounts?
Yeah, we're talking about Windows now. Talking about Windows, right?
Yes, I am.
Because my best guess has been that Microsoft is cross. You're not using its login.
Yeah.
And I don't care that it's cross.
Okay. But
by the way, I see. Yeah. Anybody else here want to come in on that? I bet you half of you are seeing that message. Are you? Anybody? Should I say anybody not seen that message? Okay.
Can I screen share?
Yes, I agree, Harry. It's Microsoft jerking the user's chain, wanting you to log into them to ensure you're who you really are.
Yeah. And that's a much prettier screen. I just see a pop-up. Whoever's showing that, whoever's showing that has got a much more impressive screen, but it is hogging the entire screen, which mine doesn't. So there you go.
That was me. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right, John. No, it's fascinating. Thank you. Anybody? Look, let's make it. I think this is an informal rule anyway. If you're talking and you just want to show us something while you're on air, you go ahead. but don't hog the screen when other people are talking, because that's not quite fair.
Can I just make one comment about the Microsoft account situation?
Yes, of course.
I've been doing tax help for quite some time, and the tax office gives you a login to Microsoft Teams, which requires a Microsoft school account. Now, when that closes down, as it will shortly, I will start to get that same message, and I have to log out of the school account. So that may be one of the things that is still residual in the situation that you're describing.
Yeah, okay. I'm kind of jealous because my dealings with the tax office, it's never invited me to a Teams discussion, but I think I'd better leave that one there. There was a pop-up. I think, by the way, that there's a conversation going on that we're all witnesses to between Steph Lancaster and Stuart Grunnickley at the moment about the fact that you actually need to do something in Thunderbird, which I think John has already done, actually. I think he secretly knows this, he's just not letting on. It doesn't happen automatically. Nothing here happens completely automatically from your point of view. Look, by now, we've all been through this 3 times, or if you haven't been, you're just so lucky, and we're glad to have you as a new member, because we've changed email services 3 times since 2013. So I was dealing, well, I'm about to email a member who joined in 1990, and I was reflecting that probably she's went for 25 years before we went and caused her to change her provider. But we went to Outlook.com, courtesy of Microsoft, only to find they pulled the rug from under us within a year. Hence, we ended up with Office 365, and that's now been running for 6 years, so that's better. But we've decided it's safer on all grounds to go to Google. So go to God, go to Google. They both begin with G, but let's hope we stay with Google. So yes, Steph, you actually have to do something, and there's some wonderful documentation, and the author is present in this company, and it's not me, that we mentioned in our email to you about how to set up Thunderbird. Richard B, again, yes, you're on. Sorry, Tom, I saw Richard first. Beg your pardon.
Is it easy to have multiple Microsoft accounts and then to be able to distinguish separate OneDrive areas for each of those accounts?
Now, I'm so glad you asked that question.
I've got a friend that's got a school account with OneDrive attached, but she wants to keep that separate from her personal.
Oh, look, if you were, let's start with OneDrive on the web. You're going to use the login to that account, and that's the OneDrive you get. And if you're not sure which account you're in, it's Google or Microsoft, you just mouse up to the top right and you get told what you're logged in as, right? But now, regarding the client side, if you're using the Microsoft OneDrive local client, which I hope you are, because that's half the point of these things, I think, then you'll see that, first of all, the Microsoft rules are you can only have one personal account with a single instance of the client OneDrive. You can have multiple work accounts if you're lucky to have multiple employers, or unlucky as the case may be. And you'll see, if I cause my Explorer to come up, that the one for your, my MelbPC Outlook Office 365 is called OneDrive Melbourne PC User Group Inc. In other words, they're going to brand the business one with the owner of the domain, right? So you know which is which on your desktop. The other one just boringly says personal, but that's good enough because you're only allowed one of those anyway, so you know which it is. Okay? Tom, sorry, you have a hand and you need to unmute yourself again, sorry.
Yes.
Good?
Thank you. I just got a fright. I thought I switched over to from Microsoft to Google.
Yes.
Now, whilst you were talking, I switched over to my Thunderbird email.
Yes.
And I looked at the account, and unfortunately, its server type is a POP, and server name is still Outlook Office 365.com.
Right.
Now I need to change that. Now, what was that to be changed to?
Well, look, Tom, as it happens, thanks, I think, to our own wonderful gurus in the background, by now we've persuaded Thunderbird that the default settings for the server are those for our Gmail service. So if you say to Thunderbird, please, I want to start a new account in Thunderbird, and you give the MelbPC address, magically, you'll get the right settings. So you don't need to remember the port numbers. You don't need to know the server names. You just tell Thunderbird you're wanting to connect to an account called T-Rado. I can't remember which way it goes now, at melbpc.org.au.
How about that?
I mean, some kind friend is putting them up on the screen, but I don't think you need to do that any longer. That's the SMTP, which is the sending server.
What was that again? Would that?
You want it up again?
Tom, they're on our website, on what was Leighton West's carefully curated page, on which he most magnanimously put the settings for our new service. So if you go to I Help Common Settings, you will find them all on our website.
Well, can I change that now on my?
Yes, mute yourself. Well, look, now, well, I don't want you to hog all the airtime, but if you wish to take time out and do that, Tom, and tell us whether you've succeeded or failed, we'll all be sitting at the edge of our chairs waiting to hear the message, okay?
That's all right. Now, the thing is that the port number can remain the same, can it?
If you're using IMAP, the answer is yes. And if you're using Thunderbird, which doesn't support Exchange, that's correct, yes.
So all I have to do is change Outlook Office to SMTP.
You don't change on the same account. Now, I said a moment ago that in a particular respect, the users of Desktop Outlook have a slightly rougher ride for the next few days. There is a feature of Thunderbird which has haunted us, Tom, that even sometimes when members enter the correct new settings, somewhere in the depths of Thunderbird's memory, it remembers the Microsoft ones, and then you get error messages. But rather than frighten you with that, I'd rather you just went ahead and tried, even though Steph is telling us it hasn't worked for her. Try that first. Always pick the low-hanging fruit first, and only go to extreme measures when the low-hanging fruit has all been stolen from the tree, okay? Now there was, I'm trying to persuade, I want to go into chat now, sorry, because I want chat people to have a fair crack of the whip. Steph, you just have to come to the transition team for that. We can't really do things live on air, but I had another one. Oh, okay, there's a fascinatingly deep remark there about Firefox. So, how did I guess who it's from? Okay, thank you, Peter. Right. But there's a new message below. Let me, yes. Yeah, that's Stuart. That's exactly what I was saying. Thank you, Stuart. Don't try to tweak an existing account. That way lies deep frustration. Start a new one in your Thunderbird. The good thing about Thunderbird from our point of view, from the point of view of what I was just saying, is that it will accommodate both the old and the new, so you can interrogate the archive of your old mail while you're waiting for it all to arrive in the new place, right? Very easily there. Otherwise, a very easy way, actually, if you're at all used to using browser mail, webmail, is to have two tabs on the same browser and just swap between them. In terms of interface, that's probably the fastest way of getting between them, actually. Now, where are we?
Harry, I run POP. And with POP, I did use my old Office 365 configured account. I changed it to Google servers and the Google password. And once I okayed it in the web interface, everything worked.
Yeah, I think, look, Dave, we should be careful. There are many pill poppers or pop enthusiasts in MelbPC, and I had a funny experience the other day. You see, we had a discussion going in the support team around Outlook because we were all a bit bamboozled by the different behaviors we're seeing in Outlook when we try and enter the second account. And the statistically favored view is that Outlook will let you have 2 accounts of different types. But I was supporting a member a few days ago, and we looked at the accounts in accounts settings in Outlook on the desktop, and we saw the existing one for Microsoft. We installed the same email address for Google, and the old one disappeared.
Yeah, it hates it.
So I'm speculating. One case doesn't prove a rule with Outlook, least of all with Outlook, Dave, but that Outlook may simply decide, oh, we've got a different service, and just replace the email interaction side of what is a constant PST file, right? Because you can always use the same PST file. So the whole design of Outlook for POP is quite different from its design for IMAP or Exchange.
Yeah, but it goes by the email address.
Yeah,
you can do it, but it's really difficult and it doesn't like it. You're not meant to do it.
Don't try it at home. Is that what you're saying, Dave?
That's right.
Okay.
Change clients.
Cedric, sorry, are you coming back? Sorry, Cedric.
Yeah, going back quite a bit in your discussion where you said you were getting those pop-ups about logging in.
Yes.
I don't think I've ever seen that. I'm logged in on a Microsoft account rather than a local account.
Right.
And I don't think I've ever seen that message.
Well, that is consistent with the hypothesis that I was sharing with John Thompson, isn't it?
Yeah. I was just wanting to say, yes, I'd agree with you.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. I mean, I was expecting somebody with very much deeper knowledge of Windows to come up and correct me, but I'm not saying that proves I'm right, by the way. They may be too busy having their cup of tea at the moment, right? Okay, how are we doing? By the way, I'm very impressed. This is the first of these iHelp sessions where we've had questions running right from the start. I'm delighted. You're all getting your questions in before Christmas, are you? Because otherwise it looks as if we'll be 2 months before we can see each other again, though iHelp has even been known to answer queries on Christmas Day, actually. I'm not promising, by the way, but okay. Yes, we're having an interesting running commentary from Steph there. I hope you can all see it.
Harry, we've gone beyond the official finishing time.
Okay, thank you, Chairman.
That's fine, because my running sheet here says the official close.
Yes.
But then it says hand back to Harry for casual chat. So if we formally close the meeting because of those that wish to get away, and no doubt that you will be staying behind for the casual chat. So I'd just like to thank everyone for attending here and at home. You Zoomers, I'm sorry you missed Kirsten and I discussing virtual meetings, but we found that the man talking about Facebook was far more interesting. Don't forget the waffle sig at Fong's for those of you here that may wish to attend. Our next meeting's February the 2nd. Don't turn up in January, the first Wednesday in January. There'll be no one here. This is Kirsten's last official gig. She said she's going to be hovering around in the background, David. I don't know whether you've heard that one, but she'd be willing to assist stepping back. I'm sure she'd be willing to help anyone that took over the job. It's not that onerous. She's looked after me well, and as someone said, prevented a good running sheet. All the best to everyone for Christmas, and we'll catch you all next year.